Good evening. I'm Alan Price, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and on behalf of all of my library and foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are watching this evening's program online, as well as all of you who are here with us in person tonight. Watashi wa Alan Price desu. Kono tabi wa kono daiji na ibent ni okoshi kudasari arigatou gozaimasu. Legaciesがこのような機会をくださったこと、とっても素晴らしいことだと思います。皆さんどうぞ、お友達を美術館に連れてきてください。I would like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors Bank of America and the Lowell Institute, as well as the Mass Cultural Council and our media sponsor, the Boston Globe. And we are so grateful to the Boston Lyric Opera, the New England Japanese American Citizen League, and the Japan Society of Boston for their partnership in bringing this important program to the library this evening. And weather and traffic permitting, I'm also so glad to welcome Consul General Suzuki of Japan, who plans to be with us this evening. We thank you all for silencing your cell phones. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. And when the Q&A begins, we will invite those of you who are joining us in person to proceed to the microphones in the aisles to ask your questions. We're so pleased to welcome you all this evening and hope you'll be able to do so often. Tonight, in addition to the wonderful program that is about to start, I hope you are able to enjoy our new special exhibit, Service and Sacrifice, World War II, A Shared Experience. And if you didn't get to see it, come back and see it the next time. History is complicated, and our World War II exhibit not only has tremendous historic stories that we should all be proud of, it also has painful lessons from which we all should learn. And we hope tonight's conversation will complement your experience in the exhibit. We're so grateful to have this opportunity to explore the lasting cultural legacy of the United States' forced mass removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II with our distinguished guests this evening. I'm now delighted to introduce Nina Yoshida Nelsen, a mezzo-soprano. She is an avid advocate for equity in the arts. She is perhaps most well known for her countless performances of Suzuki and Madama Butterfly with opera companies throughout North America and Europe. Also well known for her work in contemporary opera, she has sung in 7 world premieres, as well as their subsequent productions. She is the artistic advisor at Boston Lyric Opera and serves as president of the Asian Opera Alliance, an organization of which she is a co-founder. Currently, she is serving as the dramaturg for Boston Lyric Opera's upcoming production of Madama Butterfly. Please join me in welcoming our special guests.
Good evening. On behalf of Boston Lyric Opera, the Japanese American Citizens League, and the Japan Society of Boston, I would like to welcome you today to our stories, Cultural Legacy of Japanese American Incarceration. My name is Nina Yoshida Nelsen, and I am an artistic advisor at Boston Lyric Opera, a member of the JACL, and a proud Japanese American. Today, on a day that has become such a symbol of our freedom as Americans, we gather to share our past stories and to reinforce the importance of civil liberties, security, and fundamental freedoms that belong to all Americans in equal measure. Before we get into the conversation, I feel like it's important to give you all a brief history about Japanese American incarceration. On February 19th, 1942, 81 years ago, just a few months after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, FDR signed Executive Order 9066 into action. This order stated that all people of Japanese descent living on the west coast of the United States must be evacuated from the coastal areas to what eventually became 10 incarceration camps in extremely remote areas in the western United States. Without due process of law or any factual basis for this hysteria, other than having at least 1/16 or more Japanese ancestry, over 120,000 Japanese Americans were removed from their homes, bringing with them only what they could carry. Many were only given 48 hours to prepare. Over 2/3 of these 120,000 people were US citizens, having been born and raised in the United States. Most of the other 1/3 were legal permanent residents who had no path to citizenship, as they did not speak or write in English, which was required at the time to take a citizenship test. Although some neighbors and friends were kind enough to store belongings for their Japanese American neighbors, most lost their property and homes and had to sell whatever they could for pennies on the dollar. In 1983, based on calculations by a congressional investigation, it was found that because of this forced incarceration, the Japanese Americans' property loss was $1.3 billion, and that the net income loss was $2.7 billion. If that was in 1983, think about what those numbers would be today. It was later found that there was not a single case of espionage ever convicted in the Japanese American population during World War II. I share with you all just a brief bit of history to give you context for what we will be talking about today in this panel. Madame Butterfly has become quite a divisive opera in recent years, and Boston Lyric Opera has spent the past several years studying why it is considered problematic through a project we called the Butterfly Process. And from the process, we created a new production based on what we learned in those conversations. We have chosen to tell a real Asian American story based in history, as opposed to the traditional Orientalist fantasy we often see on stage. We have also done our best to eliminate harmful stereotypes, and instead we share the humanity of Japanese Americans. BLO sets acts 2 and 3 of Butterfly in Japanese incarceration camps. We have a saying in our community, never again. But how can we prevent things like this from happening again if we aren't telling and retelling the real lived stories of people who were incarcerated? Hosting this panel in conjunction with our production is extremely important because even as a Japanese American myself, I learned very little about incarceration in school. And even though our opera is based in history, it is still a fictional story. So we found it important to also find a space to tell real Japanese American history. It wasn't until I became an opera singer that I was drawn to my family's history. My grandparents met as 17 and 19-year-olds, respectively, when they were incarcerated in Poston, Arizona. Their lives were turned upside down. Their ability to go to university was taken away from them. The racism they experienced post-World War II was extreme. And sharing their experiences has become part of my why. So today, we share some of that why with you. How has the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans come to shape who we are as a community, as a society, and most importantly, in our art? I invite with you to share in the stories of our cultural legacy with our guest panelists. I urge you to listen, learn, and expand your own minds by considering how we can learn from our past mistakes, both in history and on stage, in order to create a better future. We thank you for being here today, for bringing your whole selves and being present with us. We look forward to sharing this space with everyone in attendance, and at the end of the panel, we will have some time for audience questions. We decided to start our program today with some music, but before you hear this music, it's important for you to hear the backstory. The opera industry is small. If we don't know each other personally, we are most likely separated by 1 degree of separation. So when I think of other Japanese Americans in our industry, there are only 2 others who come to mind who also had family that were incarcerated. The first being someone who I've worked with quite often, but the other I met here in Boston about 1.5 years ago, Doug Sumi. We had heard about each other for years, and we happened to be in Boston at the same time and had lunch. So as we started spending time together, we started talking about our shared paths of growing up in California, our love for opera, and of course, our family's history of being incarcerated. At one point, Doug mentioned that he had always wished that there were songs written about incarceration, or with text by people who had been incarcerated. He jokingly mentioned he thought he could write some songs, even though he had never composed before. Part of his job as a pianist and professor is examining the relationship of music and poetry. 6 months after our first lunch, Doug and I were on a call planning a concert of Asian American music in New Orleans we had both been hired for. I blurted out, "I guess it's time to write those songs, Doug." And that is how these songs came to be. I will let Doug take it away from here to share a little bit about his family's history and these songs.
Thank you and good evening. Thank you, Nina, and thank you to BLO, JCL, Japan Society of Boston, and the JFK Library for hosting this important event and allowing me to participate in this way. As Nina mentioned, these songs are the beginning of a new composing venture of mine, which in many ways I can thank Nina for. Within our world of classical music and opera, we have this small, intimate genre, which we refer to as art song, which is simply poetry set to song for voice and piano. And I work with singers a ton. I teach courses on this, but I don't consider myself a composer necessarily. And so thank you, Nina, for sort of giving me the nudge to put my ideas down on paper. This poetry set to music offers glimpses into experiences of incarcerated Japanese Americans during World War II. Through the words of Mitsuye Yamada and Lawson Fusao Inada. Coincidentally, through my process of researching Japanese American poetry and poets, I learned that Inada's family and my family actually knew each other. In fact, his father was my father's family dentist. So my dad gave me all the horror stories from Dr. Inada. And we frequented Inada's family fish market as well in Fresno. At any rate, we have 5 short songs from 5 short poems, 4 of which are from Lawson Inada. The first one, Evacuation. Oh, and I notice in the programs there's a QR code that you can use your phone to make sure it's silenced and also to find the texts there. The first one, Evacuation. This term was an intentional misnomer of propaganda, of course, as nobody was being evacuated. The poet would have been around 19 when being evacuated and captures a moment between her and a reporter photographer from the Seattle Times. The second piece, the Fresno Assembly Center. In a very short poem, we learn of these assembly centers, which another misnomer of propaganda, nobody was assembling. Often they were fairgrounds, horse stables. I learned at some point, a year not too long ago, that my grandparents were married in the Santa Anita racetrack horse stables. And alongside other Japanese Americans, where they were forced to live before being directed to more remote locations in the country's interior. Fresno, California is where my family is from, and I'm from just south of there. The third song, The Legend of Protest. In another concise poem, we experience Americans losing their constitutional First Amendment rights, and the speaker offers a comparison to hostages and hostage takers. Of course, everyone would later learn that there wasn't one case of espionage. The fourth poem and song, The Legend of Shoyu. Shoyu meaning soy sauce in Japanese. Here, Inada draws a comparison between the Black experience and the blues with the experience of the Japanese Americans. Forms of jazz and Black artists were a major influence on Inada's poetry, and particularly because he grew up in a predominantly Black neighborhood of Fresno. So it isn't necessarily about shoyu, but about how blues elements and the challenges of discrimination relates to the incarcerated experience. We hear references to the great blues pioneer Muddy Waters with double meaning. It so happens that Inada was incarcerated in Arkansas in those muddy waters of the Mississippi Delta with my family. only miles away from where the legendary blues musician came. We hear the repetition of the text at the end of the poem, another feature of the blues, here set to music idiomatic of the blues. And the final song and poem set to song, The Legend of the Hakujin Woman, which means a white person in Japanese. Here we discover the perspective of a white woman, the camps, and the ironic freedom she possesses, which of course all Americans thought they did, and her decision to choose love over hate and fear. We have 5 songs, and there will be more that I'll attempt to set, or poems to set to song, as Inada has given us a wealth of poetry from his book, Legends from Camp, depicting a variety of camp experiences. An ironic title, of course, as none of these are legends, right? But I think that's the point. In short, the root of fear, fear of other, is ignorance. And that is why we are all here today, to continue to be enlightened by our experiences as Americans, and why education is essential to progress as a free society. To quote the great James Baldwin, "I love America more than any country in the world, and exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually." Thank you.
As we boarded the bus, bags on both sides, I had never packed 2 bags before on a vacation lasting forever. The Seattle Times photographer said, "Smile." So obediently I smiled, and the caption the next day read, "Not smiling faces, a lesson to Tokyo." To get into the fair, you have to pay admission. We got in for free to the Fresno family prison. The FBI swooped in early, taking our elders in the process for subversive that and this. People ask, why didn't you protest? Why didn't you protest? Well, you legend had it that even in Arkansas, some people had soy sauce. Well, not exactly our soy sauce, which we were starved for. But some related kind of dark and definitive liquid to flavor you through the day. That camp was in the Delta, where the muddy waters lay. Black shoyu, black shoyu, let me taste the blues. The legend is about legendary freedom of choice options. Because this Arcadian woman chose to be there, she could have been anywhere. New York City, Fresno, or over with the administration. Instead, she selected an ordinary barracks room to share with her husband.
Our first panelist today reached out to me about 2.5 years ago when I started the Asian Opera Alliance. When I received his email, I immediately wondered why my cousin, Michael Sakamoto, was emailing me. And I soon realized that, in fact, this was not my cousin, Michael Sakamoto. This was a different Michael Sakamoto. When you meet another Japanese American, often the first question is, where did you grow up? A lot of times, Southern California. And usually the second question is, where was your family incarcerated? Michael is an incredible leader in the Asian American arts community, and I'm so happy to have him here to speak about his family and his art. Please welcome Michael.
Thank you, Nina. Oop, is this on? Yeah. Thank you, Nina. I have some images to share. I'm going to talk about, I'm primarily known as a dance theater artist, as an artist. But what a lot of people don't know is actually photography is my first medium. I was very lucky in my high school, Schur High School in Montebello, had one of the top I don't know how they measure these things, but one of the top high school photography programs on the West Coast, if not the country. And so I've always been obsessed with images. My grandfather, especially the older gentleman in the left-hand photo, my grandpa Kurose, constantly took photos throughout his life. The title is Yonsei, which means fourth generation in Japanese. I often say that being Yonsei, at least from the original generations of Japanese immigrants to this country, we're kind of the first generation that, while we're aware of our cultural heritage, we don't have sort of that same sort of weight on our shoulders and expectation of each previous generation. And so you can kind of, I read these photos, and that's my Sakamoto side on the right-hand side. That's my grandfather and my father and myself. I read each generation in these photos as a kind of successive, on the superficial level, sort of lightening of the load, but there's always something underneath. Next slide, please. So for example, Nisei, which second generation, my father on the right, that's him with my grandmother, my grandfather's wife, Jane, in Manzanar in June of 1944. So this is my father's first, one of his first photos, prison photo. And so the thing I say about, one of the things I like to talk about Nisei is that there's always this given of difference and trauma that's sort of embedded in the psyche, and that's something I think that does pass on through generations. Next slide, please. So going back to my other Kurose side of my family, so parallel, this is my grandmother. So the older woman in the lower left hand of the photo, and center up top, so my Uncle Joey and my grandmother Mitsue. This is their photo in Rower concentration camp in Arkansas on February 15th, 1945. So when I was growing up, what you don't hear about are any of these stories. If you even thought to ask as a third or fourth generation, at least in my family, and to be honest, most of the families I knew growing up in Southern California, you got maybe one fact. My grandmother Kurose would say, oh, yeah, we still have a spoon lying around somewhere, or a mug. I don't know, I lost it. That's all I remember. In other words, they didn't want to talk about it. My grandfather on my Sakamoto side, the one thing he would talk about is the one time there was a riot. They did start to protest the conditions, and they shot someone dead, so they stopped protesting. So, next slide, please. Issei, the first generation, oh, and sorry, on the last slide you saw Nisei, non-alien. So that's how on the relocation order in 1942 they didn't call them citizens, they called us non-aliens. So in other words, still legally othered. So Issei also termed as alien, so my great-grandfather Kako on my paternal mother's side, her father, he was co-owner of the biggest hotel in Little Tokyo in downtown LA in the 30s, the original Miyako Hotel, which he handed over to in 1942 to a white business colleague that he actually trusted, but he died a year later, and his kids kept the business, and so we lost everything. My great-grandparents on the Sakamoto side emigrated to Maui in 1903. Also very complicated because he made bamboo irrigation flumes so efficient in a way that the Baldwin Alexander Company, who colonized and raped the land, couldn't figure out themselves, that he saved them so much time and money that they actually deeded him, our family, 8 acres of land, which they sold to be able to move to the mainland 30 years later. So it's a little complicated. Next slide, please. So I became an artist, which I don't have time to go into all the whys, but just to say that, feeling a need to express myself out of that generation, because as I'll say, as my sort of inheritance psychically and culturally as a Japanese and Asian American, I'm a pretty good observer. I don't want to say I'm a good judge of people, but I'm pretty good observing details of people without necessarily calling things out, because that's how I was taught. So Buto, a dance out of Japan, which comes out of the post-war era, which is really about the body in crisis, that identity crisis of being westernized rapidly as a colony and everything but name. And being very closely integrated with photographers. So as a dancer, as a photographer, as a performer, as someone who's aware of themselves as American, but in this Asian body, Buto completely appealed to me. So this is one of my earlier performance photos. This isn't a stage performance I did, but for me, taking images, that kind of ambivalent body image, sort of came naturally. So in terms of the difference in trauma that we inherited, for me as an artist, it also at least gave me and lots of other people I know the ability to just kind of free ourselves, because our premises were so fraught to begin with. Next slide, please. These are just some images out of post-war Japan. This is also what I sort of feel as an inheritance. I have another thesis, another talk where I talk about how those artists and then next generation Buto artists internationally inherited some form of the blues that were the trauma and the kind of ambivalence underneath the American occupation. So thank you, Doug and Nina, for pointing that out as well. Next slide. So from all of that, I created a character. One of my most recent projects, which isn't, I do mostly stage performances, but this is me going back to photography. So Monk is this character name I created for myself, which is an acronym for Mu in Japanese, nothingness or emptiness, void. I'm a Zen practitioner. Not knowing from Zen practice or beginner's mind. And then the funk, because I'm also hip-hop inflected, that's also my inheritance, being a child of the 70s and 80s. Things like running in front of the beat, earthiness, a return to fundamentals. So I'll put all that together, my artist nickname, which for me is about unpacking this liminal transnational Buto body. Next slide. So there's lots of Buto photos from the 60s and 70s, the 50s, that are pretty famous in photo and dance history. And so I wanted to unpack that through the project. So Hijikata, the creator of Buto, on the left in his father's home village of Tashiro, Japan, in Akita Prefecture. I went back and visited there. I took, they don't have that rice stalk drying fence, but they do have these snowdrift fences. So I'm like, so I took photos trying to figure out who I was and how did that leave on in my body. Next slide. Paris was also the first place in the West in 1977 where Buto really kind of gained a foothold culturally in the West, and this kind of Euro fascination with all things Oriental. I was also trying to find my body in that inheritance as a Westerner as well. Next slide. Sorry, I put a fade on that by accident. So I mentioned my great-grandparents moved to Maui. I also went back and visited a few years ago to do a shoot. Well, that last one, it's at the, sorry for the transitions. That's at the Alexander Baldwin factory that is a museum now. Thank you. And that's a Hawaiian Airlines jet, which brings thousands of tourists to the island every day, which is now majority white population. Next slide. San Francisco, Chinatown, where Act 1 of Madama Butterfly is set. For me, it's also this strange thing of like, who is this mysterious figure that is always known and unknown in the urban landscape? And even on the West Coast, where you have a lot of Asian populations, it still often feels very ambivalent, so I was exploring that. Next slide. And then finally, Manzanar, concentration camp where my father was born, in Central California, finding kind of where, again, these old images, Buto images, how did that live in my body? How was that post-war body in crisis and body image in crisis? How does that live on in my Asian and Japanese American body? Next slide, please. also Manzanar. I found this, when I got there, I had this immediate thought when I drove up and parked. I said, what would my father as a baby have played with in those days, right? And I thought, oh, well, kids in the 40s, I guess, little kids, maybe they played with, I don't know, jacks. And I found this jack lying on the ground, this rusted jack, 5 minutes later. It's really strange. Next slide, please. This is the hospital ground that my father was born on. So for them, for Hijikata, it was miso and nigiri, rice balls. For me, it's as an Asian American, an Asian Westerner, it's the Madeleine. I'm sorry, why am I forgetting the famous author's name? French author. But anyway, next slide. My grandparents were married in the Christian church on camp, but my grandmother did convert from Buddhism in her family. So for my wife and I felt like I needed to take a picture to also honor her side of the family and their belief system. Next slide, please. And basketball. I just love basketball, and a lot. I played Little League in the Asian American leagues, and so for me, the fact that they had a basketball camp, also a baseball diamond in camp, says something about just that kind of spirit, that sort of embodied at the root spirit and playing basketball on dirt, literally. Next slide. And then, of course, the guard tower, and being in prison. This is a Japanese cooking wear apron that I dance with. Next slide. And that's it. And I'm from Southern California. Thank you very much. Please stand. Okay.
Thank you. At this point, we're going to invite our other two panelists up to the stage as well. And I find it really fascinating to have this conversation about how, as Japanese Americans, our identity influences our art. And there is no one more apropos to have this conversation with than our second panelist, who was incarcerated himself as a young child. And it's really incredible for us all to be able to hear from him today, because it's not something we get to hear very often. And we are very grateful to Paul Chihara, who traveled here from New York City to share his story with us today.
Hello. Good evening. Konbanwa. I'm sorry to do this, but I want to see whom I'm speaking to. My name is Paul Chihara. My Japanese name is Seiko. I do speak Japanese, but I was born in Seattle, Washington, as was my wife, who's sitting in the front row, and I want to talk about her for 1 second, to her surprise. Her grandparents were Presbyterian missionaries to the Far East, to the court of Thailand, Siam. You all know the story of Anna and the King of Siam. Her grandmother wrote it, based on Anna Leon Owens's, an English marm who settled in Siam, was sent there as a missionary. And of course, that became the great musical by Rodgers and Hammerstein called The King and I. I say that because it's part of my life too, because I'm a musician. I have been my whole life. The good Lord gave me one talent, and that's music. And I tell you this because it really does give you a good idea of what I think about Minidoka, not Manzanar. I grew up in Minidoka. That's in southern Idaho.
Can you tell us about how old you were when
I
you
was
were
born in
incarcerated?
1938. The Second World War is thought to have begun in 1939 when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union. I was in the relocation camp from my years, from 4 to 7. We were actually released about 6 months before the end of the war, but not permitted to go back to the West Coast, which was considered a military zone. My father had been separated from our family because he was considered a threat to the security of the United States. I want you to get a good look at me, not only because I'm handsome, but primarily because I'm a survivor of the relocation camp, and there are not many of us left. I know that because my friends are all gone. They're all in heaven, waiting for me. I'm going to give them a long wait because I still have a lot to say.
That's right. You mentioned to me that when you were in camp, that's where you found your love of music and performing. I would love to hear about some of those stories of you in camp singing songs.
Well, you have to understand, my father was arrested on the evening of December 7th, 1941. That is the very evening of Pearl Harbor. Don't tell me that the United States didn't know we were about to go to war, because the FBI came to our home, and we did not live in Japantown. There was no such thing as Japantown in any city in the United States until maybe the last 20 years, when Mitsubishi and other companies decided to make this a commercially viable thing. We lived in what was then called Chinatown, now called the International Settlement, in Seattle. My parents came to the United States from southern Japan, Kansai as they call it, Wakayama. Most Japanese Americans do not come from Tokyo or the large cities. They came from the regions that grew rice. They were basically uneducated, even in Japan. My parents must have had a very high IQ because they had 3 sons. Each of us has a PhD. Each of us was a chairman of a major university in the United States. I at UCLA, my brother Ted at Purdue, my brother Charles at the University of California at Berkeley, chairman of the philosophy department. Where did we get our desire to have an education? It came from our parents, who respected that. Now, my father was arrested by the FBI on the evening of December 7th, 1941, and we did not hear from him or see him until right at the end of the war. Now, I mention this because there were not, if you go to the West Coast, and many of you have been there, I'm sure, or maybe you're from there, there are large Asian communities in some parts of the West Coast, particularly in Southern California. There's a large settlement from after the Vietnam War, where people from what used to be called Indochina settled. They're now in an area called Little Saigon, which is in Westminster, Southern California, near Los Angeles. But the Japanese, we did not live in Japantown because that was asking to get beat up. I'm a little guy, right? I was little then too, believe it or not. But my father said to us, you have to learn to fight because they hate you. And we said, Daddy, I don't want to fight, I'm a violinist. The good nuns, we were sent to a Catholic school. They gave me violin and piano lessons, and I adored it. This started, believe it or not, when we were in Minidoka. Every Saturday, we used to congregate in what we called the mess hall. Remember, we lived in barracks that looked very much like the US military because they were built by the Army Corps of Engineers. The same people who built Fort Ord and Fort Lewis built Minidoka, and probably Manzanar too, all right? And in these camps, I remember it very well. Now, I don't know how other people's memories of the past operate, but can you remember your years between the years 3 and 8 when you were 8 years old? Because I remember it vividly. And it's not because I saw it in movies. I remember it because I was there. But to answer your question, and which makes me, I think, special, at least in my eyes and in the eyes of my wife, is that I'm a musician. And God gave me that talent. I don't know why I got it, but thank you, Jesus. Because as a matter of fact, I hear very well and I remember everything that I hear. I used to sing, we used to entertain each other. I hate to say this, but I had a captive audience. I used to sing, Shina no yoru, Shina no yoru yo, Minato no akari bunan, and on and on. Or I would sing, my mama done told me when I was in knee pants. I was in knee pants, by the way. My mama done told me, son. That's from Blues in the Night. Now, everybody knows that song because Bing Crosby made it a #1 hit on the Hit Parade. Is anybody in this hall old enough to remember what the Hit Parade means? It was a #1 song there. Frank Sinatra also sang it, as did the most memorable one was by Joe Stafford. I grew up with that, and I remember those songs. Many of the songs are still popular, but most of them are not, but I remember them. That's the gift that God gave me, and I'm very pleased because as I'm getting older, I'm now 85 years old, but I remember those days as if it were yesterday. I can't remember what I did yesterday, by the way.
I'm curious, as a composer, many of you might have seen the movie Farewell to Manzanar, and you wrote the soundtrack to that movie. Would you talk a little bit about what it's like to write music about your own lived experience?
Well, I have to say this. I didn't know I was going to go to Hollywood. I didn't know I was going to work on Broadway, both of which I've done, which I do. Believe it or not, I was living in Boston for 2 years in 1970, and I loved it here, and I still love it here. I don't come here very often, and it's changed. It's a gorgeous building that we're in. But I remember it very well. I was a good friend with Seiji Ozawa. We were at Tanglewood together. I had performances commissioned by the Boston Symphony. I've had performances at Symphony Hall. I knew that orchestra very well. My wife doesn't know this, but I was engaged to the principal violist of the Boston Symphony. Her name was Patty McCarty. Some of you may know her. I can tell you a lot of stories about the BSO. But I don't because I'm a nice Japanese gentleman. One thing I want to say, we're talking a lot about our civilization and how things are going and so forth, and there's a big threat. The premier of North Korea is now in Russia. There's great fear every place about all these coalitions coming against us. It wasn't any different in 1939 or in 1941 when we were incarcerated. But every Friday or every Saturday we had our canteen, and people asked me to entertain. Well, they asked most of the things, the bonodori and so forth, Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-da-da-da-dum. I could sing the top 40 in Japanese from that era. For me, music was always about being close to people and entertaining and being loved, because one thing we were not loved. And it's another thing to be Japanese American, especially of that generation. In every town in the United States, there are large settlements of Asians, and usually you hear their language being spoken. In Chinatown in Seattle in 1945, we spoke Japanese with each other, but every place else we spoke English. I was getting into fights all the time because my father, and I think this is why I never found out, we tried to do some research, several lawyers and other researchers, why was my father, Isao Chihara, arrested by the FBI on the very evening, look it up, on the very evening, December 7th, 1941. They knew exactly where we lived, and we did not live in Chinatown. He came back. I did not grow up with him, but when he came back, I didn't like him. How could you like somebody who was alcoholic and abusive and would occasionally beat up on mom? We hated him, and we feared him, and yet we knew he loved us. That's what the Army did to him. But we are not an angry minority. Think about it. Think of the diversity in our United States, and think about how many Japanese Americans are here. By the way, have you noticed there are fewer of us now than even 10 years ago? I asked Midori, the very famous violinist who is now on the faculty at USC. Remember, I was, until recently, a professor, a distinguished professor, I was called at UCLA. I said, Midori, who are our people? She said, our people. I always felt good when she said that to me. aren't coming here anymore. I said, why? I think she meant universities, not just in general. She said, they're all going to Germany. I studied in Germany. I speak very good German, by the way. I studied at the Hochschule für Musik in Berlin. I lived with a German family. I loved it there. I loved the German people because they loved me. They didn't call me Paul or Seiko. They called me der kleine Japaner. No matter where I went, Austria, Vienna, any place, I was der kleine Japaner. People knew me as a very good composer. I seem to be following war, or war follows me. I did a television show for 4 years on ABC television called China Beach. It was about the nurses who served in Vietnam. During the Korean War, which began just 5 years after the end of the Second World War, all of a sudden there was a new Asian threat, and America changed overnight. We were called Japs by everybody before then. After 1950, the threat was Communist Korea, North Korea, and worst of all, China. How the world has changed. Overnight, it changed. And all of a sudden, we became fashionable. None of us would have said, let's have sushi when we were in school. None of us would have talked about any of those things which are now fashionable. Can you imagine? We were afraid that people would see that we were Japanese and not Chinese.
I think that's really interesting to go from what you're saying about how no one talked about what it was like to be Japanese or to be Asian in the United States. And it leads right into what Erin is about to talk about, which is about sharing our stories.
Yes.
And so we're going to go over to Erin to talk a little bit, and then we're going to all talk together after she's done. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you so much, Nina and Michael and all the folks here from BLO and JFK Library. It's been such a lovely afternoon spending time with all of you. My name is Erin Aoyama, and I am, I think, listed as a historian on the program, a musician in a past life, perhaps. But I'm here to talk a little bit about historical memory and what I work on, which I refer to as the afterlives of Japanese American redress. So thinking about how the sort of memories, the cultural production that has come out of the stories from camp and from our community's incarceration continue to shape the lives of my generation of Japanese Americans, but also folks beyond lines of our own community. So this is just an opening slide from a wonderful artist who's based in Providence, Rhode Island, where I live, Lois Harada, who made some of these posters. My grandmother and her family were incarcerated at Heart Mountain, so I just wanted to start with that image. So next slide, please. So I want to talk today a little bit in the time that I have about some of the parts of my research or my work that don't show up in, the dissertation or the articles that I write, but that are so much a part of why I do what I do and the questions that I ask. And that's about my family history. So these are my grandparents. This is Chikara and my grandmother Misa, and this is them in 1945, 1946, after the war. My grandfather grew up on Maui, actually also on a pineapple plantation run by the Baldwin family, and he enlisted in the 442nd, which was the segregated all-Japanese American unit in the Army. He was one of the sort of first round of volunteers in February of 1943, and my auntie, his younger sister, talks about it as he just wanted to get out. He wanted to get off the islands, and he wanted something more for his life, and for him, that meant enlisting in the Army. This is my grandmother at her nursing school graduation in 1945. She was 20 years old when she was sent to Heart Mountain in northwestern Wyoming with her family. Maybe we could go to the next slide, please. My grandparents met in post-war New York. The stories range from it was a blind date to my grandmother was boarding a ship to Europe and she met my grandfather and then never went to Europe. Somewhere in the middle of there, I think, is the truth. They were married on Long Island, and then they moved back to Southern California, where my father and his brother were born and raised. And my siblings and I are my grandparents' only grandchildren, and we grew up in Connecticut. I am a born and raised New Englander, and so we were far from our grandparents, and we were far from sort of Japanese American communities, it felt like growing up. But I have so many memories of my grandparents visiting us, always between the months of May and mid-October. They never came when it was cold. And they would just spend time with us, usually about a week, and they'd come to everything we did. They'd usually cook one meal for us, which was always a treat. It was something different than we had usually. And most of my memories of my grandmother are of her sitting and knitting. She was just knitting all the time, and so I can hear the clicking of her needles, and she was always working on something that turned into a beautiful sweater or scarf or something, but at the moment I could never see what it was going to become. And she tried to teach me when I was probably 6 or 7, and I was terrible. I did not do well with knitting at all, and so we gave that up. But my grandparents never talked about their experiences in the war, which, as Michael mentioned, very common. And my grandmother passed away the summer before I started 5th grade. So it also was not something that I knew how to ask about or even knew had happened. I have one memory of my grandfather in the years before he passed away watching a documentary about the 442nd at our house. And I remember sitting behind him. He was this tall, slim man, and I just watched the back of his head the whole time. And after the movie ended, he just turned to us, and my memory of it is that he said, "That's what happened," and that was it. No further conversation, nothing else. Next slide, please. So when I went to college, my junior year, I had the opportunity to develop my own syllabus for a history course that I was taking. And so this was sort of the first time for me as someone who was, in New England, didn't have a lot of Asian American studies courses, really none at all, to learn about my own family's history. And so this sort of started this journey that I am on now, 10 years later. And in the process, I've come across so many pieces of my family's history, including these photographs. So these are my grandparents in 1940. My grandmother had just graduated from high school, so that's her senior photo. And this is my grandfather, who really grew up, I think, between the years of 1940 and 1945. But this is him after he's completed his Eagle Scout project in Hawaii. So I was 20 as I started this research, which was the same age that my grandparents were as they sort of entered their World War II experiences. And I've reflected on that a lot recently, the way that sort of their stories have grown up along with me in this process. And 10 years later, I'm still doing this research. Next slide, please. And finding things. This is a screenshot of a scan from the National Archives of my grandmother's application to leave Heart Mountain Camp when she was trying to go to nursing school. She went first to Grand Junction, Colorado, and waited to be admitted through the National Japanese American Student Relocation Committee to go to nursing school, which is what she wanted to do. So I've gotten to learn these little tidbits, and I've also really gotten to be part of a Japanese American community, which I think this day is also really representative of. There's so many wonderful stories, next slide please, that I've been able to hear and become part of, and so many wonderful Japanese Americans and elders especially, who I feel like have adopted me into their lives and their stories, even as I've still sort of not been able to learn all that much more about the people that mean the most to me. So it's, as a historian, I think, a deeply humbling experience to have these questions and to know so much, but to still have these silences and these gaps, especially about the parts that made me and made my parents, made my family who we are. So in 2017, I went to Heart Mountain as a researcher for the first time. It was actually my second visit. This is just an image from last summer, actually, but I have many versions of the same photo of this mountain that's called Heart Mountain or Four Tops Father. And it was this experience of learning so much and really enjoying being at a place, finding so much meaning at this place that I know my grandmother probably hated. It was probably the worst years of her life. But for me, being there was so deeply meaningful. And one of the things that came out of that first visit was Dakota, who was the museum manager at the time, took me through the final accountability roster that they have at Heart Mountain, which basically was their way of, the government's way of keeping track of who was arriving and leaving from camp. And so we found my family's entry, which didn't have a whole lot of information in it just because of when they left camp. But one of the pieces of information in there that I hadn't known to look for was the date of my grandmother's arrival at camp, which was August 12th, 1942. And Dakota told me that that was the first train that arrived at Heart Mountain from the temporary detention centers on the West Coast, which meant that my grandmother had volunteered to take the train first, to get to camp first, before it was done being built, so that she could be part of the team they probably did not call it a team, but part of the process of getting it ready for everyone else. And she came by herself. And so that piece of information was probably the most I've ever learned about my grandmother's experience at camp, that she took it on herself. Maybe where she was so terrible that she needed to leave, or she wanted to be part of making something terrible a little bit better for other people. That was a really meaningful experience for me. And I remember going through the museum for the first time and having this I was nervous, my heart was beating really fast because I was convinced that I was gonna see a photograph of my grandmother. And I was just sure that I was gonna see it and I was gonna know it was her. I had never seen a photo of her actually as a young person, so I probably would not have recognized her. But I just think of that moment of being so sure that I was gonna see her. But I didn't, and I still haven't. But this last year, as I was doing some research for my dissertation and just flipping through a book, I came across this photo, next slide please, that actually is my grandfather at camp. And this is a photograph that I had picked up a book. I was trying to find a quote that I knew existed and I couldn't remember where it came from, and I was just flipping through this book that had been sitting next to my desk for about 2 weeks. And I like to look at pictures in books, even today. And I found this photo, and this was not the grandparent that I expected to see in a camp photo. But it was this kind of amazing moment of recognizing him. His name was in the caption too. But to see this sort of proof of his experience. And also, I've always wondered whether my grandparents ever talked to each other about their experiences during the war. I wondered if my grandfather ever told my grandmother about being wounded or some of his buddies sort of being killed near him, or if my grandmother ever tried to explain camp to him. And so to see this photo and to know that he at least had had this experience and had been in one of the camps kind of added even more nuance, even more questions really for me to that photo. So I'll sort of wrap this up by going back to knitting, which is something I would sometimes try to do this more artfully, but I will just go back to that moment. All of my memories about my grandmother are of her knitting, and I have sweaters from her today that my mom has passed down to me that I wear, on special occasions or when I'm writing my dissertation or feeling stressed about something. And in a way, sort of my inability to knit became a metaphor for what I didn't know about my grandmother. And I used to complain about this so much in the beginning of grad school that my advisor, who is also Japanese American, also a knitter, Naoko Shibusawa, sat me down one day to talk about research, but she also brought an extra set of knitting needles, and she was like, Erin, I'm gonna teach you to knit today. You can't keep complaining about this, it's time. So we were sitting there talking about classes and research, and a couple minutes in, she looked at me and said, you know what you're doing. I didn't actually even teach you. You're just sort of going. And I was just knitting. Not well, it wasn't beautiful, but my hands knew what to do. And it was this moment, honestly, it took me a few weeks to recognize this muscle memory that was there, that I'd watched my grandmother knit for hours as a little kid, and it was still with me, that part of her and that piece of her. Next slide, please. So the next time I went through the Heart Mountain Museum, I found this blanket that was part of an exhibit that was, this is how we made these barracks our homes. And we have almost the exact same blanket at my house today that my grandmother made for us at some point when we were kids. And for me, this was the proof that she was there. And I think I immediately started crying because it just was this, of course, this is not even maybe an artifact, maybe it was made after the war, but this is proof of my grandmother's presence and her memory. And it's not a beautiful photo, but to me, this is her in camp. Next slide, please. So I think as I think about what it means to work through and talk through and write about memory, I think so much about the pieces that we can't always capture in our writing, which is where art comes in, I think, or creating. And for me, when I talk to students, I think about, how do we introduce our family stories as history too? How do we make those the inheritance of all of us? Not just the stories of, what ends up in our textbooks or what we think of as American history. This is a picture of a tag from one of my aunties has this sweater that she's held onto from my grandmother that has a tag that says, from the knitting needles of Misa, that my grandmother used to stitch into all of her sweaters. And so I carry this kind of image with me as I think of these sweaters that carry the memories of my grandmother, even as I don't always get to know them. Thank you.
Beautiful. I had all this stuff planned for how we would have this whole conversation together after everyone had their little bit of talking about themselves, and we want to have time for questions as well. So I think we're not going to go into that group conversation, and we'll leave that for questions. We are going to invite Ken Oye up to the stage on behalf of the JACL, who's going to talk briefly about his family's experience and what the JACL does here in Boston before we move on to questions.
Well, thank you very much, Nina. So the event has been focusing on cultural legacies, and what I want to do is a teeny bit of family history and political legacies of incarceration. So most families did not talk about their experiences. That's come up again and again. My parents did. So they were locked up in Arizona and in Arkansas. The black shoyu mentioned in your piece was maybe part of my dad's diet, sitting in Jerome, Arkansas, before moving to Arizona. What was unusual about them was that they talked about what happened, not with bitterness, not with a lot on their own personal deprivation or loss of property, which was there. But the lesson that they conveyed to us was, don't let it happen to others. And when it does happen, and it does, do your best to help out. Where did this come from? My dad was sitting there in the Arizona desert, and the American Friends Service Committee reached out to try to help. Anise, a friend of mine, actually mentioned over the weekend that the school supplies actually came from outside. And they said, listen, when you're behind the barbed wire, when you're being abused, people reaching out and helping matters a lot. It's not so much the trinket, the clothes, it's knowing that someone is looking out for you. So my father did refugee relief work as his profession after the war. My mother worked at the Media Fellowship Help on civil rights stuff. Reach out to others and help. And if you look at JACL, it started focusing, of course, on the needs of Japanese Americans. There's the issue of redress, which many of you have heard about, certainly citizenship issues. But in recent years, the focus, like my parents, has come to be on the threat to civil liberties of others. One of the events actually took place here in the Kennedy Library. A previous director, John Shattuck, set up an event with Bob Matsui, a congressman from California. And the event was after 9/11. We sit here on this day thinking very much about those terrible events. But the Kennedy Library Forum focused on Japanese Americans and incarceration as something that can happen, and turned very much to the issue of the threat to Arab Americans, to Muslims following the tragic events of 9/11, being targeted not by virtue of what they did as individuals, but targeted by virtue of the group that they belonged to, their ethnicity and their religion. That event here in this library was a wonderful event. It hit C-SPAN, it had the effects that you'd want, the discussions that we had were good. But the question really is, what do we do? My parents kept saying, you have a responsibility to look out for others. And if we look today, we look at recent years, the threat to the civil liberties of immigrants, the threat to Arab Americans and Muslims continues. But we also heard earlier about the threat to Chinese Americans as the Korean War broke out. And we see a resumption of that, I'm going to call it hysteria, because the focus on individuals of a particularly ethnic group, their targeting, is something that we're seeing a bit more of these days. So I promised the organizers I'd be brief, and I will, but I just want to end actually on my father's words. Don't let it happen to others. Look out for others. That is our duty. That is our responsibility. It was the theme of that forum here in the Kennedy Library, and it's something that I'd encourage all of us to be thinking about as we leave this forum today and as we move into the question and answer period. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken. I would love to open it up to any questions out there online or in person. Come on up to the microphone if you have questions. And if no one has questions, I will start asking some questions up. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Hello, I actually have a question from an online viewer. So this is for Nina. And they asked, how do you keep the integrity of Madame Butterfly as well as the new important message? And this viewer noted that they have seen many modern productions of classic operas, and often they become something different. So they wanted your feedback on that.
Yeah, thanks for asking. We at Boston Lyric Opera have spent the past over 2 years studying Madame Butterfly and why Madame Butterfly is often seen as problematic, especially within the Asian American community. The first thing that we did at BLO was we held panels with scholars and people who were interested in talking about some of the problems that can potentially arise when we produce Madame Butterfly. So first, we listened. And we listened to the people who have something at stake when we put this on the stage. And from that, we took what we learned and we said, okay, let's put it to action on stage. And what this meant was, it meant that we're paying attention to what can be harmful to people, whether you know it or not. When you see something, and when you're sitting in the audience, what you see on the stage affects the way we look at the people in our society. So we took those things that we heard were potentially problematic tropes, and we said, okay, how can we do away with some of these? But what people love, what people kept coming back to, was the music of Puccini. So how do we keep that story alive and take away some of the harmful stuff that other people see as being problematic? And our director, Phil Chan, came up with, he says this question all the time, what else could it be? And so we look at, what else could this be? He says, you have a pencil when you're a little kid. Sometimes it's a magic wand. Sometimes it's a sword. So how can we use our imagination? We don't live in a museum. We're not producing museum art. So how can we create art for multicultural audiences today to come and enjoy and see part of themselves up on the stage? So I think what we've done is we've taken this gorgeous story and we've brought it to the United States. We're telling a congruent story at a different time period in a different location, but with Japanese Americans in the center of the story, as opposed to an Orientalist fantasy, which is what we normally see when we're on stage. So I'm happy to keep talking. We can go to more questions. We can talk up here about how you all feel about Madame Butterfly being reimagined. Any more questions? We can talk about Madame Butterfly. Oh, another question, yes.
Yeah.
I've been to Ponson, I've been to Bashpula, I've been to Sakamoto. I'm very familiar with it, a photographic documentary type perspective. You use the word never again, which ties into the Holocaust, also used in that medium. But the Holocaust has many museums, many places to go. And I've taken photographs right near the Capitol of the internment camp, which gives Americans the impression that we recognize it. But when you really go to the camps, it's shocking. Almost a non-existence, that strongly. So my question to you, if never again, what are you looking and trying to accomplish from an American's perspective? Because most people in school don't know anything about the internment camps. You can go to Arkansas, you can go to Utah, you can go all these places, and they're barren. They don't exist. So my question is, what follow-up from this type of audience do you think can be accomplished? And I took pictures of Bobby Kennedy, and I would be amazed if he were here tonight, what he would have said if he had gone to these kinds of facilities, because I know how shocking he found the Mississippi Delta when he went there himself.
Would anyone like to take that? You want to take
Sure,
that?
I'm
Yeah. Yeah.
I think I have two thoughts that come to mind in response to your question. One is that there is incredible work being done by Japanese American community organizations and individuals, I think folks on this stage too, to try to tell more of these stories. There's the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. There are some museums at some of these sites, as you've indicated, but one of the challenges is that these places, the 10 main concentration camps in the United States are in out-of-the-way places. They're difficult to get to. They are barren. That was intentional, right? This was part of the program to remove folks from the West Coast, make this land productive, and then move these people away again. And so there's that challenge of how do you memorialize a history that was created to be forgotten, right? That was meant to be quieted, that you have, the survivors of it who didn't want to talk about it, needed to focus on survival after the war. But there are really amazing programs going on. I was part of some teacher workshops in Wyoming this summer and teacher workshops in Arkansas. So some of it is focusing on the places where these camps were to try and bring folks in and ask questions about, what do you know at this place? What do you think about this site? Because most of these sites were, prison camps for Japanese Americans, but before that were something else, and before that were something else. And so there's this sort of place-based approach that I think is really powerful. On the other side, I think as a historian and as an Asian American historian and as an Asian American person, I care about Japanese American incarceration history because it's the histories that most shaped my family, and it's the stories that I did not learn about growing up in Connecticut. I loved American history, and I learned about the American Revolution 5 times before I graduated high school. We never got to World War II. And so I know I care about this because it's my family story. But when I'm teaching students, even in Asian American studies classes or ethnic studies classes, I try to invite in questions about students' own families and communities. I want them to learn about Japanese American history, but I also know that they don't get to learn about their own stories often or their own communities. And so there's a way of, I think, being in conversation and in community with each other where we bring our whole selves, as Nina said in the beginning, we bring our questions and our stories, and we can learn about each other's communities that make up, what we think of as the United States today. But it is a challenge because, there are so many stories and so many voices that we don't hear. And so I think going in from a perspective of community engagement, of place-based, and of sort of students themselves and the communities that we come from is really important as well.
I liked your question a lot, Sarah, but I'd like to add a different viewpoint to that. Pearl Harbor occurred on December 7th, 1941. On December 8th, the United States declared war on Japan. The following day, the Germans declared war on us, as did the Axis powers. Now imagine this, 127,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated. 2/3 of them, like myself, were American citizens. My parents were not, having been born in Wakayama. But imagine this, why didn't we then incarcerate all the German Americans? And how about the Italian Americans? Can you imagine trying to round up 100,000 Italian Americans? Who would have the courage to do that? I wouldn't. I wanted to point out something that no one has said anything about. It was racism, pure and simple. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and most of the farmers in the Pacific Northwest, as in Central California, the breadbasket of the United States, if not the world, were Japanese. All of those lands were confiscated and sold, and the Japanese never got back to Fresno or the San Joaquin Valley or something, all right? That was racism. Why do I say this? Not because it sounds like I'm bitter, I'm not. I've been asked to speak, since I'm one of the few survivors now of the relocation camp. I wanted to point out that we are not an angry minority. Look at us. We're 4 generations. I was thinking about that. We're 4 generations of Japanese Americans. I don't know what it is about us that made us so, because we are fierce warriors. I didn't tell you, my father was arrested because he was a sensei, a teacher of martial arts. He was 5'2" and he was tough as nails. But he loved America. And I love America, isn't that something? I want you to know there's another spiritual element that nobody talks about. And I think one of the threats to our country, and I say our country meaning I'm speaking as an American citizen, is what seems to be a kind of spiritual decay. And I'm not speaking as a practicing Roman Catholic when I say that. I'm just saying that life for me in this society seems very different now than when I was even in Minidoka.
Thank you. I saw one, yes, go ahead. This is, I think, probably time for our last question. We might have one more depending upon.
I recently had the opportunity to be at the Japanese American History Museum in Los Angeles, and it hurt to be there. The building has, for those folks who have not been there, has inside it one of the tar paper shacks that our fellow citizens were forced to live in. And I thought about that a lot. And last month, I was at the Anne Frank Museum and House. And the rounding up of Jews in the Netherlands and the rounding up of the Japanese in America and the conflict that I feel about that is something I really haven't resolved yet. And I think we need to think about that, about how we are introspective, and the gentleman who spoke earlier about making sure we protect one another, my words, I think is really, really important. I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. Absolutely. I was actually at the Japanese American National Museum with Doug, my friend and pianist, just a couple of months ago, and they, I think it just last year, first time released a public book of all over 120,000 people who were incarcerated. And this book is over 1,000 pages long. And Doug and I went, and we had to make a reservation. And what you do is you go and you acknowledge your ancestors. And they give you a little stamp, and you stamp your ancestors' names, and you go through this book, and you see all of these blue stamps with people who are coming and remembering those who've come before them. And so as we are talking about how are we spreading this, how are we educating? It's places like the Japanese American National Museum. If you're interested in hearing more from people who have lived through this, an organization called Densho, D-E-N-S-H-O, you can find them online. They have collected hundreds, if not thousands, of oral histories of people who were incarcerated. And I just happened to be one day looking through, and I was like, oh, maybe I'll look up my grandma's name and see if I can find a picture of her. And up popped 25 videos of her. And they had interviewed her about her experiences, and she's been gone now for 8 years. And I was able to find my grandmother talking about her experiences. So as we are talking about educating and what our future looks like together and our humanity, there are places where you can go to learn more about what happened in the past, but also it's about how we talk about it in the future to make sure that it never happens again. So I just want to say thank you to the JFK Library, to Boston Lyric Opera, to the JACL, and to the Japan Society Boston. We hope to see you all at our production of Madame Butterfly, which opens this Thursday. You can find more information about that production and the rest of our season at blo.org. And we're interested to hear what you think about the way we've chosen to set this opera and how that changes your view on what opera can be. So we thank you all for being here this evening and hope to see you soon.